You don't notice it at first. It doesn't look like a dramatic shift or a grand romantic moment the way movies try to convince you it should. It's quieter than that, almost invisible. It happens in the space between words and the pauses that feel slightly different than before, in the way someone who usually keeps distance doesn't pull away as quickly this time. And if you're not paying attention, you might miss it completely. But if you are, you realize something important is happening, something is softening. Because when you're dealing with someone who is emotionally avoidant, love doesn't follow the usual rules. It doesn't grow louder with intensity or deeper with pressure. In fact, the more force you use, the more they retreat. And that's the part that confuses people the most. You try to love harder, show more, give more, prove more, and somehow it creates distance instead of closeness. But here's what most people never realize. Avoidant hearts don't melt from intensity. They melt from safety, from moments that don't demand anything in return, from gestures that don't corner them emotionally, from a kind of romance that doesn't feel like it's taking something away from them, but instead gives them space to come closer on their own. And when you understand that, everything changes. Because now instead of chasing connection, you start creating it in a way they can actually receive. Not loudly, not forcefully, but in a way that slowly lowers their guard without them even realizing it at first. And the moment that guard starts to come down, even just a little, that's where the real shift begins. You see it in the way they stay a little longer, in the way their responses become slightly warmer, in the way they don't shut down as quickly as they used to. It's not obvious, it's not dramatic, but it's real. And it all begins with something that feels almost too simple to matter, but changes everything when done right. One of the most powerful romantic shifts you can create doesn't look romantic at all on the surface. It doesn't involve grand gestures, emotional confessions, or intense moments of closeness. In fact, it's the opposite. It's the ability to be present without pressure. Because pressure is what triggers their instinct to pull away. The moment they feel like they have to respond, have to match your energy, have to give something back before they're ready, their system goes into defense mode. Not because they don't care, but because it feels overwhelming in a way they can't always explain. So instead of trying to pull them closer, you do something unexpected. You give without demanding. You show warmth without expecting it to be returned immediately. You create moments where they can feel connection without feeling trapped inside it. It might look like sending a message that doesn't require a response, or sharing something meaningful without turning it into a heavy emotional conversation, or simply being calm and steady in your presence instead of trying to create intensity. And at first it might feel like nothing is happening, like your effort is going unnoticed. But internally, something very different is taking place. Because for the first time, they're experiencing connection that doesn't come with pressure. And that's rare for them. So rare that they don't know how to react to it immediately, but they feel it. And more importantly, they don't feel the need to escape it. That's where the shift begins. Not in what they say, but in what they stop doing. They stop pulling away as quickly, they stop creating distance out of reflex, and instead they start staying just a little longer each time. And that little longer is everything. There's something else that starts to happen when you remove pressure from the equation. Something deeper than just comfort, something that begins to touch a part of them they usually keep hidden. Because beneath the distance, beneath the calm exterior, beneath the independence they show the world, there is a part of them that actually craves closeness. Not the overwhelming kind, not the kind that feels like it will consume them, but a softer version of it, a quieter kind of intimacy that feels safe enough to let in. The problem is they don't trust that kind of closeness easily. They've learned in ways they may not even fully understand that closeness can come with expectations, with loss of control, with emotional exposure that feels too risky. So they protect themselves by staying slightly disconnected. Not completely gone, but never fully in either. And this is where most people make a mistake. They try to break through that wall directly. They try to prove they're different. They try to show more love, more care, more intensity, hoping it will convince them to open up. But that approach only reinforces their fear, because what actually melts that wall isn't force, it's consistency. It's the quiet repetition of safe moments, the kind that don't demand anything but slowly build trust over time. It's in the way you respond calmly instead of emotionally reacting, in the way you don't punish distance with coldness, in the way you remain steady even when they're unsure. And something begins to shift inside them, slowly, subtly, almost unnoticeably at first. They start to feel less guarded, less on edge, less like they need to protect themselves at all times. And when that happens, they begin to lean in, even if they don't realize they're doing it. There's a moment that often goes unnoticed, but it's one of the most important turning points in this entire dynamic. It's not something they say out loud. It's not even something they're fully aware of themselves. It's the moment they realize being around you doesn't feel draining. For someone who is used to emotional overwhelm, to conversations that feel heavy, to expectations that feel like pressure, this is a completely different experience. And it catches them off guard. Because instead of feeling like they need to prepare themselves before interacting with you, they start to relax into it. Instead of feeling like they need space after spending time with you, they don't feel that same urgency to pull away. And that's when something very subtle but very powerful begins to happen. They start associating you with calm, with ease, with emotional safety. And once that association forms, it changes the way they respond to you completely, because now being close to you doesn't feel like a threat to their independence. It doesn't feel like something that will overwhelm them. It feels not in a loud, overwhelming way, but in a quiet, steady way that feels sustainable. And that's the kind of feeling they can actually stay in. So instead of pulling away, they start staying, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. They linger in conversations a little longer, they become slightly more open, they let their guard down in small, almost unnoticeable ways. And if you're paying attention, you can feel it happening. The distance that once felt constant starts to shrink. And then comes the part that changes everything, even though it doesn't look like much from the outside. It's not a confession. It's not a big emotional moment. It's not even something that would stand out to anyone else. It's a small act of closeness that they didn't have to give. Maybe it's them reaching out first, even if it's brief. Maybe it's them staying in a moment instead of creating distance. Maybe it's a slight shift in their tone, something warmer, something softer than before. And if you don't understand what it means, you might overlook it completely. But if you do, you realize how significant it is. Because for someone who is used to protecting themselves, even the smallest step toward closeness requires trust. It requires them to lower their guard, even if just for a moment. And that moment is everything. Because it tells you that something inside them is changing. That the safety you've been creating, the calm you've been showing, the pressure-free connection you've been building is starting to reach them, not in a way that overwhelms them, not in a way that makes them run, but in a way that makes them stay. And that's how an avoidant heart melts. Not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, in moments that most people would never even notice. Until one day, the distance that once defined everything is no longer there in the same way. And what's left feels different, softer, closer, real. But this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. Because when that softness finally begins to appear, the instinct is to move closer, faster, to finally express everything you've been holding back, to lean in with more intensity, more emotion, more presence than before. And without realizing it, that's the moment where things can quietly fall apart again. Because even though they're opening, even though they're softening, even though something real is starting to form, they're still sensitive to anything that feels like too much, too fast. So instead of rushing into that opening, you do something that feels almost counterintuitive. You slow down. You match the pace of what's being built instead of trying to accelerate it. You allow the connection to breathe, and this becomes one of the most romantic things you can do, even though it doesn't look romantic in the traditional sense, because you're showing them something they're not used to. You're showing them that closeness doesn't mean losing control. That connection doesn't mean being consumed. That love doesn't have to come with pressure. And the more you stay in that space, the more they begin to trust it. Not consciously, not in a way they can explain, but emotionally, they begin to settle into it. And when someone who is used to pulling away starts settling instead, that's when something deeper begins to take root. There's another shift that begins to happen once they feel that sense of emotional safety. It shows up in the way they start noticing you differently, not just as someone who is there, but as someone who feels different from what they've experienced before. Because they're used to patterns, used to connections that feel intense at first, then overwhelming, used to people who either demand too much or disappear completely. used to emotional extremes that make them retreat into themselves. But with you, it doesn't feel like that. And at first, they may not understand why. They might not say anything about it. They might not even fully recognize it, but they feel it. They feel the steadiness in your presence, the calm in your energy, the way you don't react impulsively or create emotional chaos when things feel uncertain. And slowly, they begin to relax into that, which leads to something very subtle, but incredibly powerful. They start thinking about you even when you're not there. Not in an overwhelming or obsessive way, but in a quiet, steady way that feels safe enough for them to stay in. They replay small moments, small interactions, the way you made them feel without demanding anything in return. And that feeling stays with them because it's not tied to pressure. It's tied to comfort. And comfort is something they don't walk away from as easily. As this continues, something even deeper begins to unfold. They start letting you see parts of them that they don't usually show. Not all at once, not in a dramatic reveal, but in small, almost unnoticeable ways. It might be a slightly more honest response, a moment where they don't deflect or change the subject, a glimpse of vulnerability that slips through before they can pull it back. And these moments, they matter more than anything else. Because for someone who is used to staying guarded, even the smallest act of openness is a risk. And here's where most people get it wrong. They see that vulnerability and they rush toward it. They try to deepen it, explore it, hold on to it. But what actually strengthens that moment is allowing it to exist without pressure, letting it breathe, receiving it without turning it into something bigger than they're ready for. Because when they realize they can be slightly open and nothing overwhelming happens as a result, it changes something inside them. It tells them that maybe, just maybe, it's safe to open a little more next time. And that's how emotional walls don't just crack, they begin to dissolve. And then there's a moment that feels almost confusing when it happens, because just when things seem to be getting closer, they might pull back again. Not completely, not in the same way as before, but enough to make you question what's happening. And if you don't understand this pattern, it can feel like everything is falling apart. But it's not. It's actually part of the process. Because when someone who is avoidant starts feeling real closeness, it can trigger an internal response they don't fully understand. A need to regain space. To make sure they're not losing themselves. To reestablish a sense of control. And this is where everything you've built can either strengthen or break. Because the natural reaction is to chase, to question, to try to fix the distance that suddenly reappears. But the most powerful thing you can do in this moment is stay grounded. You don't withdraw completely, but you don't chase either. You remain steady, consistent, unreactive in a way that feels calm, not cold. And when they sense that you're not panicking, not trying to pull them back, not creating emotional pressure in response to their distance, something shifts again, because now their need for space doesn't feel like it will cost them the connection. And that removes the fear, which makes it easier for them to come back on their own. And when they do come back, it feels different, softer than before, more intentional. Because now it's not just about connection, it's about choice. They're not moving toward you because they feel pulled or pressured. They're moving toward you because they want to. Because being with you feels easier than being away. Because the space you've created doesn't feel like something they need to escape from. It feels like something they can actually stay in. And that's when you realize something important. You didn't force this. You didn't chase it. You didn't overwhelm them into opening. You created something they could step into at their own pace. And that's what made all the difference. Because for someone who has spent so much time protecting themselves, avoiding emotional intensity, keeping distance as a way to feel safe, finding a connection that doesn't threaten that safety is rare. And when they find it, they don't run from it. They stay. Not perfectly. Not without moments of hesitation, but in a way that is real, in a way that is growing, in a way that feels like something they can finally trust. And that's how an avoidant heart truly melts. Not through force, not through intensity, but through a kind of romance that feels so safe, they don't even realize they've let their guard down until it's already happened. And by then, they're already closer than they ever expected to be. But what makes this kind of connection different, What makes it last isn't just the way it begins, it's the way you continue holding it. Because once someone who is avoidant starts to stay, there's a quiet shift that happens inside them that most people never see. It's not just about feeling safe with you anymore, it's about slowly confronting parts of themselves they've spent a long time avoiding. And that can feel unfamiliar, even unsettling at times. Because for so long, distance was their comfort zone, independence was their identity, emotional control was the way they stayed grounded, but now something is changing. They start noticing that they don't want as much distance as they used to, that being alone doesn't feel as satisfying as it once did, that your presence doesn't feel like an intrusion, it feels like something they're beginning to rely on. And that realization can create a quiet internal tension, not because it's wrong, but because it's new. So instead of reacting to that tension, instead of trying to define it or push it forward, you do something that deepens the connection even more. You allow them to experience it without forcing clarity. You don't demand labels. You don't rush emotional conversations. You don't try to lock in what's happening before it's ready. And that becomes one of the most powerful romantic signals you can give. Because you're showing them that they can feel something real without immediately having to explain it. And for someone who is used to shutting down when things feel too defined, that kind of freedom is what keeps them leaning in instead of pulling away. As this continues, something even more subtle begins to unfold. They start showing care in ways that don't look obvious. It's not grand gestures, it's not dramatic expressions of love. It's small, quiet, but deeply intentional. It might be the way they remember something you mentioned in passing, the way they check in, even briefly, the way they adjust their behavior in small ways that show they're paying attention. And if you're expecting loud affection, you might miss it. But if you understand them, you realize how meaningful it is. Because for someone who struggles with emotional expression, these small actions carry more weight than words ever could. And this is where something important happens. Instead of questioning it, instead of needing more, you recognize it. You receive it. You allow it to be enough in that moment. And when they feel that their effort, no matter how small, is seen and appreciated without being measured or compared, it reinforces something inside them. It tells them that the way they show care is valid. And that makes them want to do it more. Not because they have to, but because they feel safe enough to. There's also a deeper layer to all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. And it's the way your emotional consistency begins to rewire their expectations of love. Because before this, their understanding of connection may have been shaped by unpredictability, by moments that felt intense, followed by distance, by experiences that made closeness feel unstable or unsafe. But now they're experiencing something different, something steady, something that doesn't spike and crash, something that doesn't leave them guessing where they stand every moment. And at first, that steadiness might feel unfamiliar, even a little uncomfortable, because they're not used to it. But over time, it becomes grounding. It becomes something they start to trust. And when that trust begins to settle in, it changes the way they respond to closeness. They stop expecting it to disappear. They stop preparing for it to become overwhelming. They stop feeling like they need to protect themselves from it. And instead, they begin to relax into it. And that's when the connection moves from something fragile to something stable. But even in the stability, there will still be moments where their old patterns try to resurface. Moments where they feel the urge to pull back. Moments where they become quieter, more distant, more inward than usual. And it's not because something is wrong, it's because growth isn't linear, especially for someone who has spent so much time protecting themselves. So instead of seeing those moments as setbacks, you begin to understand them differently. You see them as part of the process, and your response stays the same. Calm, grounded, unshaken. You don't take it personally. You don't turn it into something bigger than it is. You don't withdraw your warmth just because they need a moment of space. And that consistency becomes their anchor. Because now, even when they drift slightly, they know they're not losing the connection. They know it's still there, steady, unpressured, safe. And that's what allows them to return without fear. And eventually something shifts in a way that feels almost surreal when you look back on it. Because the distance that once defined everything no longer holds the same power. The hesitation that once created space begins to fade. The walls that once felt permanent don't feel as necessary anymore. And what takes their place isn't intensity. It isn't overwhelming emotion. It isn't something dramatic or consuming. It's something quieter, but stronger. It's comfort. It's trust. It's a kind of closeness that feels natural instead of forced. And for the first time, they're not just staying because it feels safe. They're staying because it feels right. Because somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, they stopped seeing connection as something to manage and started experiencing it as something to be in. And that's the moment everything becomes real. Not because you pushed it there, not because you forced it to happen, but because you created something they could grow into at their own pace. And that's what makes it last. That's what makes it different. That's what makes it something they don't want to walk away from. Because in a world where they've spent so much time keeping distance, they finally found a connection that doesn't ask them to lose themselves to keep it. And for them, that's everything. That's what melts an avoidant heart. Not all at once. Not loudly, but slowly, safely, and in a way that stays. And when something like that begins to stay, it doesn't just change the connection, it changes the way they see themselves inside that connection. Because for so long they've been used to being the one who pulls away, the one who needs space, the one who feels overwhelmed when things get too close. But now something unfamiliar starts to happen. They notice themselves wanting to stay in moments they would have once escaped. They notice themselves thinking about you in ways that feel steady instead of intrusive. And that realization, it doesn't come with a big announcement. It comes quietly, almost like a question they don't fully say out loud. Why does this feel different? Why doesn't this feel like something I need to run from? And instead of answering that question for them, instead of trying to define what this is or where it's going, you allow them to sit in it. You allow them to discover it on their own. And that discovery becomes deeply personal to them because it's not something that was explained or pushed onto them. It's something they felt for themselves. And the more they sit in that feeling, the more something else begins to unfold. They start becoming more present with you, not because they're trying to, but because they want to. Their attention doesn't drift the same way. Their responses feel more engaged, more intentional. Even the silence between you starts to feel different, not empty, not distant, but calm. And that kind of presence is something they don't offer easily. It's not something they give out of all. It's something that only happens when they feel internally settled. So when it starts showing up, even in small ways, it means more than anything they could say. And instead of pointing it out, instead of analyzing it or trying to turn it into a bigger moment, you simply meet them there. You stay in that calm space with them. And that shared stillness, that unspoken understanding, becomes one of the most intimate forms of connection they've ever experienced. But what makes this connection truly deepen isn't just the calm moments, it's how you handle the uncertain ones. Because there will still be times where they hesitate, where they seem slightly distant, where something feels just a little off without any clear reason. And in those moments, everything you've built is quietly being tested, not by them consciously, but by the patterns they're still unlearning. And this is where your emotional steadiness becomes everything. Because instead of reacting with doubt, instead of pulling back your warmth or questioning their behavior, you remain the same. You don't chase, but you don't disappear either. You stay grounded in a way that feels consistent. And that consistency sends a message they can feel, even if they can't explain it. It tells them that this connection isn't fragile, that it doesn't collapse under small shifts, that it can hold space for both closeness and distance without breaking. And that realization, it slowly replaces the fear they've carried for so long. And as that fear begins to fade, something even more meaningful takes its place. They start choosing closeness, not just reacting to it. They begin initiating moments, even if they're subtle. A message that comes without hesitation. A moment of vulnerability that isn't quickly taken back. A presence that feels more intentional, more certain. And while these moments might seem small from the outside, internally they represent something much bigger. They represent a shift from avoidance to willingness, from protection to participation. And when someone who is used to holding back starts stepping forward on their own, that's when you know something real has taken root. And the most important part is, it didn't happen because they were convinced. It happened because they felt safe enough to choose it. And in the end, what you're left with doesn't look like the kind of love most people talk about. It's not loud. It's not overwhelming. It's not built on constant intensity or dramatic emotion. It's something quieter, but far more powerful. It's a connection where both closeness and space can exist without fear, where silence doesn't mean distance, and presence doesn't feel like pressure. It's a kind of love that feels steady, grounded, and real in a way that doesn't need to prove itself every moment. And for someone who has spent so much of their life protecting themselves from emotional overwhelm, this kind of connection doesn't just feel different, it feels right. It feels like something they can finally stay in without losing themselves. And that's the part most people never understand. An avoidant heart doesn't melt because it was chased or convinced or overwhelmed into opening. It melts because for the first time, it feels safe enough to stop running.